The wonderful co-founder of this Feminist Heretics lecture series, Holly Lawford Smith, in September this year praised radical feminism's discovery of sex as a major axis of oppression because, she said,
it made it possible to ask about the origins of sex oppression. Was it always the case? If not, when did it start and how and why? It made it possible to ask about the mechanisms by which sex oppression had been sustained through history and through which it may still be sustained today.
Holly then praised Gerda Lerner's book, The Creation of Patriarchy, for documenting the historical origins of sex oppression and for piecing together archaeological evidence to suggest that patriarchy began 5,000 years ago when women became the first slaves. This enslavement of women, Gerda Lerner wrote in 1986, allowed male-dominant societies to develop thereafter. Without a doubt, Holly is right that Gerda Lerner's painstaking work has been of huge inspiration to radical feminists who have taken heart from her message that women's subjugation is neither natural nor historically inevitable. For example, Sheila Jeffreys refers to Gerda Lerner's dating of the origins of prostitution back to ancient Mesopotamia to suggest that female sexual exploitation has a beginning and therefore can be put to an end. Other feminists build on Gerda Lerner's work to explore women's prehistory and goddess culture, and to encourage women to imagine a reality for ourselves outside of patriarchy, and to create ways of living, rituals, and even new forms of language to reflect our own unique experiences instead of those of men. But the feminist who I will talk about today is a heretic precisely because she rejects these origins stories, as she calls them, and because she opposes the, quote, replacement of patriarchal tales with feminist stories, including feminist stories about the end of matriarchy and the origins of patriarchy. Carole Pateman is an English political philosopher who was born 20 years after Gerda Lerner in 1940 and ended up having a long academic career in America, which included becoming the first female head of the International Political Science Association. She still speaks and publishes today, including most recently in 2018 at Cardiff University, where a conference was held to celebrate the 30th anniversary of her book, The Sexual Contract. Pateman published The Sexual Contract in 1988, just 2 years after the release of Gerda Lerner's book, The Creation of Patriarchy. Although both books are from the same era of late second wave feminism, they couldn't be more different. Pateman doesn't mention directly Gerda Lerner's work, but in The Sexual Contract, she rebuts the idea that the patriarchy of today's modern, Western, democratic states has anything in common with the male rule of pre-modern times, let alone that of ancient Mesopotamia. Pateman thinks that the word patriarchy makes male dominance appear as a feudal relic or a remnant of the old world of status that sets the familial, paternal, natural private sphere apart from the conventional civil public world of contract and capitalism. In fact, she thinks the word patriarchy no longer describes modern political arrangements because today's civilization takes a political form different from those former feudal or traditional forms of social organisation, she writes. And now it is fraternity rather than patriarchy that arranges social relations among the dominant class of men. Fraternity arises out of a modern state that is characterized by political life, or an idea of justice, or a law common to all, which transcends the blood ties of the feudal world and applies alike to men of different kinship groups. Different from 200 years ago, according to Pateman, in the modern world, citizenship for the first time is ostensibly universal, and thus civil fraternity extends to all men as men. Men, in other words, have become brothers to each other rather than fathers and sons. And this new arrangement of social relations enacts the modern form of the state. And this state is different from the feudal and traditional forms of the old world. Civil fraternity, Pateman reminds us, is newly achieved through the political mechanism of contract. Contract is what transforms men into civil individuals whose fraternal relations are between equals. In the modern world of work, for example, men do jobs they compete for in the market, rather than jobs inherited from grandfathers and fathers. Contract newly creates them as individuals instead of sons who must follow in the footsteps of those grandfathers and fathers. In the labour market, these individuals are subject to employers contracting for the use of a piece of property in their person. Employers gain rights of temporary ownership over a worker's labour power that is imagined to be alienated from him for the duration of the working day. In reality, though, of course, there is no discrete entity called labour power that can be separated from the worker. So what employers actually achieve through contract is temporary ownership of the worker over whom they can use as they desire for the negotiated number of hours of the working day. The political mechanism of contract critically relies on this modern fiction that there exists in the individual property in their person, which they own and which they can trade for a wage. In the job market, this property is traded as labour, even while each person in modern civilization is supposed to be individually inalienable and inviolable. In fact, therefore, it is people themselves who are traded in the labour market. After all, there exists no market in which labour is traded in the absence of live human workers. So the fiction of property in one's person works in practice to create social relations of subordination that are at odds with the civilization of the modern state. These hierarchical social relations are more like those of the feudal world, including its indenturing and its slavery. Pateman explains that the mechanism of contract creates social relationships constituted by subordination in the form of the exchange of obedience for protection. An individual living in a society organised by contract must paradoxically agree to be ruled by another in return for a wage. This is a paradox because the individual of the modern state is defined as free and autonomous in precise opposition to the unfreedom of the feudal state in which people lived under regimes of absolutist and arbitrary authority. Discovering how this paradox of the modern world is resolved so that modern liberal states can continue and endure as they have been and as they are, this is Pateman's big contribution to feminism. Through the book, The Sexual Contract, she gives us the name of the fix that resolves the paradox of the social contract of the modern state. So that through this fix, modern civilization doesn't dissolve into conditions of chaos arising from the inequality that reigns between different classes of men. The civil unfreedom that is caused by social relations based on contract is offset, Pateman tells us, by another contract, which is not referred to, but which she identifies as the sexual contract. This flip side of the social contract is a pact between men, Pateman writes, that legitimizes men's masculine right and allows them to gain material and psychological benefits from women's subjection. While men of the modern state are, she continues, bound together through their common interest in upholding the civil laws that secure their freedom, they also have another fraternal bond constituted by this sexual contract. They have a common interest as men in upholding the terms of this sexual contract and in ensuring that the law of the male sex right remains operative because, she writes, it organises orderly access by each man to a woman. In turn, modern civilization rests on this access because, as Pateman puts it, men must be bound together by a bond as men for the liberal form of the state to work, and for it not to dissolve into conflict between different classes of men. She explains that in the masculine sexual competition, unlike the competition of the capitalist market, all members of the fraternity can win a prize. Most men become husbands, but that is by no means the only way that members of the fraternity can exercise their masculine right. And Pateman explicitly names prostitution as one other way. This cost, though, that women must bear for the sake of the social contract is overlooked by feminists who take as their measure of success how far women have come since the old feudal practices of patriarchy. These feminists pin their hopes on liberal individualism as a vehicle to women's liberation. But Pateman is not unsympathetic to their project. She writes that the claim that women own the property in their persons has animated many feminist campaigns, past and present, from attempts to reform marriage law and to win citizenship to demands for abortion rights. The appeal of the idea for feminists is easy to see when the common law doctrine of coverture laid down that wives were the property of their husbands, and men still eagerly press for the enforcement of the law of male sex right and demand that women's bodies should be publicly available to them. But Pateman is ultimately critical of, she writes, the many feminists who appear to see only the advantages in the current political climate in making feminist demands in contractual terms. And, she writes, these feminists who seem to be unaware that the individual as owner is the fulcrum on which modern patriarchy turns. Gerda Lerner, by the way, for her part, insists that women have, quote, always had agency, and that it is wrong to cast women, quote, primarily as victims. In making these kind of assertions, though, Gerda Lerner can surely only be thinking about women under pre-modern patriarchy, because under modern patriarchy or fraternity, even men are robbed of agency and live as victims of civil unfreedom. This is to say nothing of the women who they sexually use and abuse through institutions of the sexual contract like marriage and prostitution. Carole Pateman's discovery of the sexual contract updates feminism for the times by telling us which institutions patriarchy most relies upon for its political life. In today's Western liberal states, these institutions are those of female sexual access. Without such access, the civil unfreedom of the social contract is laid bare and its contradictions made explosive. Men's liberal relations of hierarchy cannot survive in the absence of sexual access to a subordinated class of women. And so institutions like prostitution and marriage are crucial to retaining the male sex right. The ancient beginnings of women's oppression and prehistoric matriarchies might be good for persuading women that things can be different. But they tell us nothing about how to make them different. Persuading women that they must destroy men's sexual entitlements in the name of feminism, on the other hand, is likely to make things different. But it tells us nothing about the lengths men will go to and how much of Western civilization they will burn to the ground before they give up their pawn.